Hello and welcome to the Vicinity and Beyond podcast with me, Henry Ginman.
And me, Julie Graham.
And today we have a new topic for you. We are going to discuss the question, are business improvement districts being forced to take on too many essential services as public services retreat due to the budget pressures? This is a very, prescient topic at the moment, and one in our media is often describes public sector funding as being in crisis. Julie, are we in crisis?
I feel we're in crisis. I've been doing bids 20 years. We've been celebrating 20 years of bids this year. And I've had quite a lot of people asking, was I going to write something for the 20-year anniversary? Was I going to write a book? Was I going to write? And all year I've kind of toyed with, what would I write if I wrote something? And I guess my challenge is, I can't say too many things that are great at the moment because we are really struggling. If we divide that 20 years into 4 quarters, we've had a first quarter of the first 5 years of bids where it was hard to get going. It was hard to do things because every other agency, we were brand new and they didn't know how to interact with us. They didn't know what to do with us and they were quite reluctant to allow us onto their space. I guess the next quarter we had a willingness to start talking and interacting and having some partnership funding and activity. By the third quarter, which sort of takes us to 2019 pre-pandemic, a willingness to jointly fund, to see some really good stuff. Now, pandemic and post, it's a free-for-all. There's no money left. The bids can do whatever they like. In fact, services are being pushed our way because there is no provision elsewhere to do anything, and it's a difficult place to be.
And that's more led by the reduction in funding for public services or by belief in local authorities and public institutions that bids can and should take on those
I'd love to say it's the latter, but it's much more to do with the former. Yes, of course, we've got a positivity of, a trusted relationship and credible organisations and track record, but it's so much more to do with the lack of direct people, resource, skills, competency and budgets in the public sector, and bids being seen as a panacea to many of those things.
So let's talk about what bids are supposed to be doing, and in particular in relation to the services they're delivering and the services that local authorities and public services are delivering. And in particular, the word that keeps coming up when I go to conferences is additionality. But I've heard different definitions. What's your definition of additionality? What should bids be doing?
Well, at the beginning, the whole concept of bids was we would add value beyond the existing provision, and existing provision back then was more than just statutory services. It was statutory and discretionary services. And what the legislation of bids does, albeit quite lightly in the legislation, but it requires you to put together a statement of baseline services, which is what public provision was in place at the point you invite those businesses to vote and to invest further. And you put that statement in place so that you safeguard that public investment and the business's contribution is added value. That's the additionality. And that additionality back in, right at the beginning of this was quite significant in terms of new, innovative and absolutely discretionary services. And as time's moved on, that's got more and more and more sort of, pulled back to absolute bare bones. And in many places, and particularly the big cities, and particularly in London, we're delivering very little additionality because we're subsidising statutory services. Discretionary disappeared long ago, and statutory services are under immense pressure.
And does that idea of what is statutory differ between different places and different local authorities?
Well, not really, because the law dictates the services that are statutory. The scale of cleansing is based on Environmental Protection Act, but a return to a particular standard by a particular time. So the only bit that can vary is how a local authority defines the zones within its city as to whether it's returned to clean within an hour, within 4 hours, whatever. But no, statutory provision is about the same across the country. But what we started with 20 years ago was varying degrees of discretionary service beyond that. Yeah. Some had lost a lot of discretionary service way back. Others had huge amounts still in place, still had town centre management, still had events management, still had tourism, still had some kind of promotional destination management arm of some sort, and a load of other kind of, grants and activities, and very few, if any, have that now.
So I guess the harsh question is, so what? And if bids are this innovative, flexible model where they can deliver services in a town centre, and from my reading of the legislation, it's not clear where the line is and what additionality is. The government website makes it clear. It says there's no limit on what bids can do. There's no limit, but it must be additional. So I guess my question is, who is going to stop a bid from overreaching from additionality into essential services?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the irony. Nobody's stopping now. They're almost inviting us to, because there is a gap otherwise. So it's almost the other way around. The bid is being pulled back into backfilling the statutory service that used to get done by the public services. And we feel we have to deliver, because it's sort of silk's purse sow's ear syndrome, isn't it? It's no good us doing all the fabulous innovative stuff if the streets are filthy and it's unsafe, and we have to do those basic building blocks of a place first. And if no other agency is going to do them, there is a pressure for the business community to do that. And from a bid point of view, the levy payers, and any bid listening will know this, the businesses will challenge the on-the-ground issues all the time. And if the bid is well engaged with its community, it's the bid that will get contacted first. There's rough sleeping there, there's cleansing problems there, there's where's the police, where's this? It's the bid that gets first contact. And all of those bids that are funding additional services, there's an absolute frustration from the business community that it's bids that are doing it, not public services, but a real reluctance to stop doing it because someone has to.
Because I guess you're reliant on probably the local authority to be saying, those are our services that should be being, not yours. And if they're saying no, they're almost inviting them, then the person who can stop it or can enforce it. So then it falls on the bids themselves.
Yeah.
If we think then about the broader issue and the decline on public services, because this is, I think, is something that I was keen to understand when we started researching this. It is quite stark. We'll come back to that idea of a crisis earlier, but I was trying to understand this in a bit more detail. So local authorities can tailor over 800 local services to the needs of their residents. But between 2010 and 2020, government funding for local authorities in England and Wales decreased by nearly 60%, compelling councils to cut services such as public libraries, waste collection, road maintenance, etc. Since then, it seems like it's improved. There has been more funding going in, and in the recent budget, there'll be an increase of 28.2 billion, or 5.8% in cash terms. What impact do you think that might make?
There's an enormous catch-up to achieve. And remember, the services that local authorities deliver are far and wide. And one of our biggest challenges, even 20 years ago, but much more so now, is the ageing population and the cost of social care is so extreme that what we used to do when we first started bids, and we used to, the very first organisations, first business groupings that we were talking to, one of our kind of sells would be, so we know you pay, huge amounts in business rates. We know you feel frustrated by that not being sufficient value for money, etc. However, if we can ring fence this area for you and we can get you all together to ballot into a business plan, for every £1 of bid levy that you pay in, that entire £1 will be governed and spent locally, versus, and the first pilots were in Westminster, versus at the time, Westminster's figure, after redistribution of business rates, 6p in every £1 came back to Westminster, of which about a penny came back into street services. The rest went elsewhere into other things. Social care costs are now so extreme. I don't even know what that penny equivalent is now, but it's a lot less. So there's such a challenge that we're on such catch up. And even if there's more money coming into local authorities, it's not coming onto the managing the streets, it's coming into all of their other rising costs.
I think the thing that struck me is the scale issue here. So if the increase is 5.8% and that's 28 billion represents 5.8%, and I'm pretty sure the sum total of all the bids in the country are investing about 150 million.
Yeah.
So bids are investing 150 million. Local authorities have got an increase of 28 billion on top of what they currently do. So the services that they are delivering, and if we have a little think and name a few, whether it's street lighting, network management, roads and footways maintenance, litter bin emptying, removal of street litter, cleansing of the broader streetscape, drainage, enforcement, street washing, these are big ticket items. If you're a bid, if you start taking on some of those services or even parts of those services, what's it do to your budget? What impact can you have?
Yeah, and that's a really, really important thing when you consider scale. Again, I think every bid listening would recognise the frustration of, I've said a lot when I've been working with bids, don't let yourself become a mini town hall. You're not a local authority. You're not geared up to be a local authority. But in terms of resource, even the very, very biggest bids in London are only collecting £3 or £4 million a year. Most bids are collecting £500,000-ish a year with only 3 or 4 staff. You compare that to the authority on their patch. They've got stacks of staff, stacks of budget, stacks of responsibilities, I acknowledge, but like for like, we're incredibly fleet of foot, we're incredibly productive with our very, very small number of people. There's only so far that can go. We are not a public service provider. We're this tiny fleet of foot organisation that is innovative and can make a difference. And the more we take on the baggage of public sector services and get bogged down with majority of budget committed into routine service, the less innovative we can be and the less, difference ultimately we can make and change to a place. And all of those really interesting things we were doing to influence a change of a place, that's so far down the list when you're dealing with the basics.
You mentioned social care. I think that's one of the frightening things when you look at this stuff is just the amount of resource, which probably quite rightly is being prioritised towards social care. And so I think it was 50% of local authority budgets in 2010, now 67%, according to the Times, of local authority budgets going towards social care. And the one that really shocked me was the prevalence of disability among working age adults, 15% in 2010, 23% in recent years. So the burden on just looking after people, our aging population, and that's only going to increase. So if that's the priority and that's going to increase, get worse, presumably, I'm getting really bleak now, aren't I? The priority on our centres of our communities is not going to. But
that is the crisis
change.
We're in, and that is why we have to acknowledge there is a crisis. And I in doing some research, for something else, I re-listened to a podcast that I did back in 2019 with Andrew Carter and co from Centre for Citizens. And in 2019, we were kind of warning against this crisis really deepening and a series of sort of implications on a lot of us. But particularly talking about this rising cost of everything on the public purse that isn't what we do, in effect, social care and everything that goes with it. And what I said on that podcast, and I kind of repeat it here, is this is not a local authority bashing exercise, because if I was in the local authority, I would also dedicate my funds to those things, because they are, in the round, a higher priority than many of the things that we're doing. However, we've been an advanced, well-managed nation for the last 4 decades-ish. Our towns and cities have become really, really great places through really good management and through kind of broken windows syndrome. And we're in danger of really toppling into quite a dangerous place. And what we're seeing on the ground in many locations is, without police on the streets, many places have no police patrols at all. They've only got response teams. The only uniformed response is bids in some form or another.
Yeah.
And without cleansing and without waste management and without all those basics, we're going into quite an uncivilized environment again. And that's quite a shock to an advanced nation. And that's a real worry that, again, going back to my point about bids, cannot, without significant change, turn themselves into mini town halls. And I wonder whether they should do anyway.
Yeah, Met Police, severe budget cuts next year, 450 million, threatening up to 2,700 jobs.
Yeah. And already Met Police have, to their own admission, have major resourcing problems, failed to spend their recruitment budget last year, have got significant low capacity resourcing, not just about money, but about bobbies on the beat because of particularly their standards review and disciplinaries taken so long. So officers on suspension and with sickness, etc., their standard capacity is way below that, in some cases a third of what capacity should be in a place, which is no wonder we're not seeing any police patrols day to day. And as I say, that's that's very extreme in central London, but it's typical everywhere, which is why other agencies, and particularly bids, are putting some form of resource on the street.
So we've painted a rather bleak picture. I think now we need to shine a light of optimism, if we can, and try and come up with some helpful, practical advice for bids. And I think there is probably a desire from bids to take a greater interest in their town centres and shaping their town centres, perhaps leading on physical changes within public realm, maybe getting into public transport and in some improving transport, maybe probably not delivering, but feeding into. We see at conferences the desire to help with net zero, and where the bid is playing a role as a partner, as a delivery partner, but with bigger organisations as well. So but these are small organisations, typically two people in a place on average. So there's a lot of enthusiasm, there's the ability to be innovative, but they don't want to cross the line into becoming essential services. And so that's the game that I think we should play now is, we'll call it Where's the Line? Where's the line? And I'll present you with some things that I've seen or heard that bids have been doing. And then your initial reaction. We won't hold it to you, and our listeners won't hold it to you, just in case, because this is your spur of the moment initial thoughts. But so I'll give you some services. I'd like you to decide: are they essential? Are they, and therefore bids shouldn't be taking them on? Are they additional and bids should be considering?
Okay.
I'm sure these are blurry lines, I think, as we'll find as we get into them.
Yeah, let's have a go.
So the first one I will throw away is chewing gum. So we've mentioned how, it's a public service, cleaning our streets, a central service that local authorities are taking on. But chewing gum, on average, I believe, a couple of years ago, I read a paper that was talking about the cost to the average town was about £60,000 a year, just removing chewing gum. Can bids have an impact?
Oh, chewing gum's a funny one, actually. So the very first bid, so Kingston First was the first bid, as the name suggests. And as it started, in January 2005, it did a first 100 days. And in that first 100 days, it did a major kind of housekeeping cleanup of the place, irrespective of who owned anything, and included chewing gum removal. And the businesses were delighted because the streets hadn't been so clean for years. It's not a statutory service. There is no obligation for a local authority to clean chewing gum, which is why generally they don't do it. But I have to say, bids don't do it much either now, because they've run out of money to do that, because we're doing some of the other things that I don't know, maybe on your list in a minute. So chewing gum is additionality, I'm afraid, but hardly even gets touched by bids. Okay,
interesting, isn't it? So, local authorities will obviously cleaning cleaning streets is a statutory, but it depends on what you're cleaning.
And washing them isn't.
So hot washing?
Clearing them. Hot washing is not. No. So hot washing is in the category of chewing gum, actually, that bids in the early days often did hot washing. And I think our pavements are just getting gramier again because we haven't got the resource to do it.
Because it is expensive, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really expensive.
It's one of these, I kind of describe these as these scenarios, sort of blind design, as in if you design something well, people don't often notice that the design really works well. And it's a bit like that with this. If the streets are clean, people don't always notice until it's really, really clean. People like Singapore and places who get a reputation for. So it can have a real impact.
And you think about the scale. If you think about just how much it costs, time and resource, if you get someone else to do it or if you do it yourself, to clean your own patio. Think about that across the public space. It is enormous amount of resource.
They do. Street furniture.
Oh, well, that's an interesting one. So street furniture, there's a liability on local authorities to maintain what they've put in, whether that's street light columns, finger posts, bollards, but only the things that are public provision. Things like telephone boxes, electricity boxes that have been put in by another provider. That is their responsibility, not local authorities, which is why historically you'd see generally the sort of litter bins, the finger posts, the bollards that were council were originally reasonably well maintained and kept clean, and electricity boxes were notoriously dreadful, and telephone boxes, particularly in London, had many colourful cards inside for a particular purpose. And gradually, as bids came through, bids certainly in London dealt with the telephone calling cards issue very regularly. Gradually started seeing people lobbying to have telephone boxes moved because they weren't being used for telephones anymore. Electricity box pressures. What we've seen some really innovative stuff from bids actually. And I'll quote Worcester on this just because it's one that I know well, and I know this project they've done really well. They basically said to their council, look, we want to do some artwork across the city. We haven't got the budget to do art installations per se, but all of this stuff that's on the streets that is poor, can we just do it? Can we take that as our canvas and actually in turn improve your responsibilities effectively, but we'll do it through art. And after an initial concern of, the initial response was, but we won an award for those bollards back in the day, about 40 years ago. They allowed it. And what we've done is not just the street furniture owned by the council, but also electricity boxes and other things. And there's some fabulous kind of artistic flair and sense of place around things that either you noticed because they were grotty or you didn't notice at all, have now become some really nice public spaces. So back to your point of where's the line? The line is pretty poor here anyway. There's very little in the responsibility of the local authority other than maintaining, and the bid has picked up some things. And there's some good work we can do there. Yeah. But can we keep doing that long term? I don't know. I
think Leicester as well have done some great things where they've had art installation across their telephone boxes and random other boxes across the city. It's been really good. Let's talk about security. I'll throw a few at you here and then you can break them down, because I suspect you've obviously got bids who have rangers or ambassadors who don't intervene where there's a antisocial behaviour, shoplifting, or they try and move people on in a gentle way. I think you have bids and taking on a further or more like security officers who will intervene. And then I heard the other day of bids sometimes financing or contributing to police presence in their towns. So you've sort of got a scale of intervention in terms of what you can have. So
again, let's go back to the beginning of bids. In our pilot period in central London, we trialled a variety of things through the Circle Initiative. We had regeneration money to trial some concepts and see how it delivered. And one of them was, what would it look like and what would it cost if we put some resource into extra bodies on the street of a patrolling nature, not necessarily powers, but patrolling nature. And we trialled using security firms, uniformed up, doing some in-house. And over the first 5 or 6 years, we kind of learned a lot about who couldn't do that work. And we also learned a lot about it not being, if you wanted any powers, it not being very resource effective to have in-house staff. So now across central London, there are private companies providing significant on-site uniformed presence with some powers and body cams and some really sophisticated kit. And effectively, they are our bobbies on the beat now. That has some real connotations to it. You know, I worry about it's essential in the sense that from a business point of view, we have to do it because nobody else is doing it. But is it statutory? Yes, of course it's statutory. Of course we should have the public purse delivering that. By bids doing that, we're also masking the problem, and that worries me. So one of the pieces of work I've been doing with one of the big central London bids, Heart of London, is what we've been calling Baseline Plus. So we've been saying, well, the baseline agreement would historically say, here's the services the council does and here's what the bid's going to do. That was very outmoded because the schedules were sort of at a date ahead of ballot, never updated. So we were always, even if it was right at the point of ballot, the schedules of service provision were out of date before we got going. And what we've done is gone much further and gone into a deep dive of service mapping. What's going on the streets from a cleansing and security point of view? Who's there? And what are we delivering? And the bid is delivering a huge amount of the day-to-day environmental and reassurance management in that place. And so in terms of where's the line, if we weren't there, there's a major problem. There's a major gap. But should we be doing it? Not really.
Probably not. It's interesting because that is going to take significant budget. As well, isn't it? And I spoke to one bid, or heard of one bid recently who'd completely slashed their marketing and events budget for safety and security. I spoke to another who'd slashed it by 3/4. So the effects on, we were talking about earlier, the art installations, the attractive things, the I didn't know your phrase, the sow's ear, the
silk's person's sow's ear.
So the silk's purse is being cast aside for the sounds if I understood that correctly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, on sort of budget scale, you know, whilst we're saying that different bids have different scales of budget depending on the size of the location, every single bid I've worked with in the last 3 or 4 years, when we've been re-looking at budgets and or preparing for renewal, number one priority has been safe and secure. So proportion of budget, highest chunk is safe and secure. Because if your place is not safe, you know, there's no point. There's no point in doing anything else. And these places are not safe and secure. And it is, therefore, of course, robbing other elements of a bid budget.
And I have to ask this one. So mobile applications with trails, loyalty schemes and deals, essential services to be delivered by local authority or additional?
Absolutely additional. I mean, they used to be discretionary, and actually there were some great things went on in local authorities or arm's length sort of marketing agencies. No, all of that's absolutely disappeared. And in fact, kind of on another note, I suppose, all of that chunk of work, because we're all chasing money, is now being sort of wrapped up into the attempts to get some kind of tourism levy, tourism tax around the country. Scotland and Wales are through first stage of legislation on that.
And how would that work?
Well, for Scotland, which will be first to market, I think. So I picked up some interesting facts from Edinburgh just recently. Their intention is, in the Scottish model, the local authority would have the right to impose a visitor levy, and that would be on bed spaces on hotels. And their predictions are, and they hope to potentially have this go live in 2026, for Edinburgh's boundary of hotels, they reckon they could raise on a 5% visitor levy £50 million a year. However, and that sounds great, doesn't it? And then the trails and all of that would be amazing. However, already the figures are suggesting that of that 50 million, only 10% would be spent on visitor economy and destination marketing.
Yeah, how much goes back into the area where it's created?
The rest
how much
goes back into filling the council black hole. So we're having a shift of financing of statutory services. And whilst what we're seeing across the world, because global tourist taxes of different natures have been rapidly growing, but we're seeing this kind of transition into a different style of funding. And the visitor is potentially bearing the burden of a social care crisis in the UK. And it all depends on how price sensitive our places are as to whether that is going to be a meaningful long-term model. It might be a quick fix, but it does have, and it has ramifications for bits. In that example of Edinburgh, many of those hotels that will have a visitor levy on them to fund city council also pay the bid levy. De minimis in comparison, but still pay a bid levy. And there'll, inevitably in each of those places be quite a question mark over, does the bid deliver enough, and is it responsive enough in its way to still have that relationship with the businesses to want to carry on paying their own levy?
And something Edinburgh and some places like it, but probably not a lot. I mean, you've got the big tourist centres, haven't you? It bringing us back to the idea of security and linking. I remember speaking to one bid about trails and deals and place prestige and things like that, and being told probably somewhat flippantly that I give everyone radios and some other security measures, and I get a 90+% vote rate each time. That's me done, kind of thing. And that obviously makes me sad because I like the silk purse and the marketing and events activities. So another one I like, and that has a really nice impact. And I remember seeing Alison Herbert from Bath speaking about this, and Simon Jenner at Leicester also. They have a nighttime safe space in both of those cities where people who've been out on the night out, maybe drunk too much, can't get home, maybe not even be injured, so it's clinical or non-clinical, but it's having a real preventative impact on the NHS. And the numbers were something like, investments of 50k was returning, depending on how they measured it, anywhere between sort of 200k and 500k in reduced pressure on the NHS. But then you do have that strange dynamic of, you've got businesses in a town paying for a service which is preventing a cost on the NHS there.
Yeah. And isn't that a weird irony? I mean, I love the safe spaces. There's some brilliant projects. As you say, Bath and Leicester have done it. Worcester's done it as well. And actually, the data on the Worcester one is really interesting to put those numbers into perspective. They've funded, they got PCC, Police Crime and Commissioner funds 2 years to invest in this sort of provision. They've basically purchased a vehicle, kitted it out, and then taken on medics. And they provide a service Wednesday, Friday and Saturday nights at the moment, I think 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. And it's 2 medics on site. It's a roving vehicle. It has a couple of spaces that it moves around the city depending on the time of night. And it has a really, really positive impact for the reassurance thing, but also the reality of dealing with some, quite crisis situations in the city. The police love it. The police are hugely supportive behind it. And interestingly, one of the reasons the police love it there is because it takes a resource pressure off them. It's a really trusted triage. The way the NHS and the police is, it's a really trusted triage on the streets. It prevents the police having to get burdened with a load of time sat in A&E as a problem. And so they stay on the street for longer. From the NHS point of view, the ambulance service are very regularly connected into the safe space, and it gives them a resource to enable them to know how long they need to stay on site and takes the pressure off them. But the irony for me of that money was when we were doing the renewal for Worcester, the sort of headline fact was they're saving on average £28,000 a month for the NHS because of that service. And what I said to the bid was, that's great. But is that the right metric to tell the business why they should vote for you? Are they invested in you to save money to the NHS? I don't think they are. And there's a really different balance. It doesn't mean the businesses don't like it. Of course they like it. They're actually really, really positive about it.
Because people go into the town if they feel like it's safer,
Absolutely.
and they're more like, especially places that are promoting nighttime economy. I suppose the other important point there is, and I think I might have got this wrong, I think it was extra funding for those examples that I gave, and same with yours there with Worcester. So it's not directly being funded by the businesses. They brought in funding from other sources, but the organisation is the bid, which is funded by the businesses.
Exactly, and that's the case for Worcester. So, and it is only, and is it all of these cases that only short-term funds. So they're being hugely successful, but time is running out. Will PCC continue funding of them because they're giving huge value? Will other parties fund them? They are going to have to wash their face eventually because bids budgets won't be able to pick up the cost. Bids staffing and resourcing and wherewithal to be the driver of that, yes. But budget, no. The bids can't fund those services long term.
Well, Wes Streeting should love it. It's preventative, which is one of his big three pushes, isn't it? Last one then, and given the time of year at which we're discussing it, particularly apt, Christmas lights.
God. Yeah, I mean, even in the beginning of bids, Christmas lights from a sort of, council statutory service point of view, of course it's not statutory, but there were huge amounts through the 80s, 90s, noughties of Christmas lights and activations and light switch on events run by councils. And often it was a driving force to establish a town centre management initiative. I remember when I first was employed in Kingston upon Thames to be its first town centre manager, and the first job I was given by one of the then shopping centre managers was, I'm glad you've arrived. You can take on this Christmas lights thing because it gets on my nerves and it takes too much of my time. Can you go around and get money? To which I said, well, I could, but if you don't want me to do anything else. If you want to add value from my involvement, you need to carry on doing that. I'll do some extra bits. And I did. And I've just spoken to a bid recently, actually, who was amused and has done a similar thing. We did the challenge of let's just have a blackout Christmas and prove whether actually everyone really needs this, because we spend so much time lighting. It's a huge budget. And it is all falling on bids. It's not even just the lighting now. Back in the day, you would get fixings, the stress testing, that would all be done by local authorities. Bids do that as well now. We do the whole thing. Installations, we do the installations. Great example in central London, actually, just recently. Look, the local authorities, some local authorities are, I think on the positive, some local authorities are now becoming more entrepreneurial and thinking through the assets that they've got and how they can kind of utilise them better, but not necessarily sufficiently well thought through yet to work for all of us. So a central London bid that used to charge out a public space for a light installation, historically £600 a year for the entire Christmas period, tried to charge £5,000 a day this year, to which you said, well, that's ridiculous, we haven't got the budget. So tell you what, we'll do it on private space instead, which we have. And actually it's worked out wonderfully and we'll go back there. Did anybody rent out that public space for £5,000 a day? Of course they didn't. So it was a complete own goal. We've actually lost something through that initiative. There's another, it's not Christmas per se, but events. There's another thing that's been going on around the country, temporary event notices that used to be given for lots of activities that smaller bids would just pay 20 quid for a notice, and that was fine. Now councils are transferring those into premises licences, which are significantly more. So what used to cost you perhaps £20 is now costing you £500. And when you're in a budget of only a couple of thousand, that's becoming really prohibitive.
Yeah.
So Christmas, all discretionary, all a huge cost to bids, and we do the stress testing. And yeah, there's an expectation we do it. But when the pressure's on clean and safe, it's becoming a budget pressure in a lot of bids.
So I hope I've covered off some ones that people will be interested in. But I suppose if you do have...
Can I do one more?
Yeah,
that you haven't asked me about? Homeless and rough sleeping.
Okay.
Big problem. Big problem from a societal point of view. Big concern on a human level. But what's happening in reality on the streets. Now, if I go to central London, particularly because that's where it's really stark, we've not just got a bit of rough sleeping, we've got organised encampments that have got quite significant crime associated with them. And for a quite significant period of time, that's been building. And it's been seen as a civil issue, not a crime issue. So police have not really been engaging. Local authorities have been engaging a small amount. There's been some work, some great work in trying to resource dealing with the human problem first. How do we rehouse these people? But to give an example directly that I've just been dealing with in Fitzrovia Partnership, Tottenham Court Road, the only reason we've suddenly got a real focus on an encampment in Tottenham Court Road in the last 2 weeks is because there was a fire and half the encampment was burnt down on a Sunday evening. Now, thankfully, there are no fatalities, but it's allowed us to get the agencies and the surrounding owners to now say, come on, this is a major problem. But where are the police in this? They're not there because they see it as a civil issue. Is there a crime issue? Of course there is, because there's this whole load of crime associated with some of these. They are organised crime initiatives around some of these encampments. Now, that's not to say there's not genuine rust
send people out, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. So should bids deal with that one? Well, I had a conversation with a board member just the other day on this issue when I was putting it as a major risk, and this individual said to me, it's not a major risk to us because we don't have to deal with it. Going back to an earlier point, bids in many locations are the only visible presence on a street. If we're turning a blind eye to it, businesses think we're failing. So we have to deal with it. We have, even if we just try and corral and align other agencies to listen, we have to deal with it. We can, we're kind of damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. There is a, very, very sensitive series of issues dealing with rough sleeping and homeless, obviously. But we can't turn a blind eye and pretend it's not our problem because the businesses, especially the businesses surrounding those problems, absolutely expect us to do something. And it's a huge cost and it's a huge resource issue. And there's a huge human story in there that, again, did we design bids to do this? I don't think we did.
Because the crime issue is you've got gangs trafficking people into the country, organising them to beg across the city, and then taking the money into the gangs, paying a pittance to these people and then sending them back. So that's a real crime issue, which presumably your argument there is that's making it statutory. But the role you're seeing the bid play there is more of a lobbying role of, you're not saying we need to take on those responsibilities. We need to lobby the groups that should be, and keep making that point that this is the statutory. This should be statutory. This should be you.
But in the Tottenham Court Road example, because there's been a fire and there's been a clean-up, and it's being led by the American church there because it's right on their patch, and they're coming at it from a concern and reassurance of a human scale first, but also now there's some clearance. We're trying to actively work out what we put onto that space to make it a good quality public space for public use, because otherwise it's going to be refilled with encampment. And as the days go by, the greater chances that will happen. And we've just got to act. And the bid's a major part of that process because the formal agencies are too far behind it.
It's not easy, is it? It's tricky.
It's really not easy.
These are not all black and white. These are not all essential or additional. They are falling in the middle, and bids are filling the gap to a degree. So I think if anyone has any more examples that they'd like to share, please do share them with us wherever we share the podcast. And if time, maybe Julie can respond to a few and give her point of view. I guess the key question for me that's coming out of that is, are bids equipped to take on some essential services? Or some of these issues are so great in scale that, do bids have the resources, or is it diluting the purpose that you originally set out?
Yeah, and I think there's 2 or 3 things in that. The first one is, it really worries me the extent at which we're masking the problem because of our fleet of foot delivery. So in the work I referred to of Heart of London, where we're doing the service mapping, we are absolutely demonstrating the scale of effort that we're putting in on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis. And the level of detail goes down to, the hour of the day that fly posting or graffiti is removed, et cetera, et cetera. You've got that level of detail so that even if for the moment we're the sticking plaster, we are showing the scale of effort required to keep it at a even vaguely safe space. And And that's critical we do that, because otherwise, particularly policing, just going back to that point, the resource allocation is based on crime levels. If we're masking the crime levels because we're actually doing it, we get less resource when eventually they get some resource. If they get some more resource, we get less because we've dealt with, or at least held, the problem at bay. So we have to be really cognizant of not hiding the fact that we're masking.
And that's we as the broader we, the system, not we as in bids.
Yes,
right?
absolutely, yeah. The kind of next point, I suppose, is around what's the implications of the bids picking up various of these things. I referred to sort of mini town halls earlier and us avoiding being that. If the businesses through bids start picking up some of these fundamental service areas by default, like what's the formative driver for doing them? It's business need, not residential need. Those services there based on residential need, first and foremost, and residents, drive the agenda through their voting and their voice into local authorities. And yet it's businesses paying, and bids are being influenced by their businesses to how to emphasise their service. I mean, we are getting lots of residents actively now getting involved with bids because they're realising that bids can solve some of their problems for them.
Go knocking on their doors and
that has a different kind of piece of the jigsaw in terms of accountability. But then I guess the third piece for me, and the practical bit, because I'm always on the detail, concerned about the detail and concerned about the kind of substance of what we do. We didn't really design these organisations to be established institutions for service delivery of this scale. They're fleet of foot entrepreneurial organisations that could be highly creative and responsive and proactive. And so if we are getting bogged down with this kind of scale of service, we have to revisit what we are in terms of organisation skills, competences, infrastructure ourselves, the scale of GDPR resistance we've got, freedom of information challenges that we're increasingly getting because we're delivering services that are perceived as public services, even though a bid isn't directly required to respond to FOI. And there's been quite a debate on this. Some have been challenging that bids are basically delivering public services via this bid levy into the council and back out. So we should be responding on all FOI claims. I go back to the numbers thing. If we've only got 3 people in a bid delivering £500,000 of services going every which way 24/7, how can we possibly have a data management team that deals with freedom of information claims as well? Absolutely impossible. Are we geared up from an infrastructure point of view, even in our insurances, to do these things? No. Are we geared up from a staff point of view in training and resilience to do all these things? No. I mean, the example of the safe space stuff has been really interesting. It's a couple of the projects that I've been involved with there. One of the very early weekend examples, a bid manager came back to me and said, you wouldn't believe what we dealt with in the first weekend. And it was really challenging. And there was a really positive, it was a potential suicide. And they were hugely relieved the impact they made.
Yeah.
My answer back to them, that's amazing. Now what have you backfilled into your team to support you as individuals? Because you can't do all those things without training and support behind you. You're not going to cope. And that person went, I didn't think of it like that. We're not geared up to do these things. We're not trained individuals with any, resource behind us to know how to. Some people can naturally do things, but we have to skill ourselves up to do it. So it's, a few stick and plasters in the short term, we can probably make it work. But no, we're not geared up to do this long term, and we're going to have to really rethink the industry.
And even that example you gave, you'd be in the top quartile of bids with a budget like $500,000 in the UK. On the resident point, I guess it's interesting because it's all interconnected, isn't it?
Yeah.
And a lot of the work we do is about connecting people with their places, residents with the businesses, because that's how the businesses thrive. And so we talk a lot about building digital communities of residents so that they are a resource that can be tapped into and remarketed to and retargeted. So it's even on the point about residents, bids do inevitably engage with the broader population and do things for the broader population by trying to do things for the businesses to which they are accountable. So let's bring it to a close with some conclusions and some strategies for bids. And maybe we think of a couple of different types of bids. Imagine you're a small one-person band in the countryside, and you've got a budget of 200k. Imagine you're a bid manager with a team of 3 at 500k, and imagine you're a city manager with a team of 10. What are the strategies that you would recommend in order to combat the pressures that you're feeling to take on essential services?
Yeah. So I think the biggest risk is in that middle category, actually. So if I just knock the other two off first, so the smaller category, when it's one person and 200k, there's so little capacity to go and deliver directly that you're going to stay in a lobbying role because you have no budget and ability to get much further. So there's a frustration in there that you're going to continue lobbying and advocacy, but actually you don't have, your constant defence is we haven't got any money to put that resource on the street. Therefore, I can only talk about it. So there's a frustration component there, but probably not a huge amount of additional risk. At the top end, the much, much bigger bids that have got some much bigger bucks, nothing like public purse, but some bigger bucks. They are being really, really resourceful and really innovative and hugely entrepreneurial and doing some brilliant things. And when they're doing the brilliant things, the kind of watchword is continually consider, is your organisation geared up to do it, and what are the risks involved? And thinking through the risk register to the business. Where are your greatest risks, and have you sufficiently put mitigation in place? And that might be insurances, it might be skill sets, it might be focusing on formal partnering relationships. I mean, one of the things I think we need to advocate for more is that particularly at the larger end, a formal relationship with these other partners and a true legal acknowledgement of it. So, a statutory bids are not legally statutory consultees, but they could be recognised as a full consultee in the local authority, with the police force, with others. And they need to be, because at that scale, what we're seeing is they're last at the table in crisis rather than ever being invited to the table in strategising. So they're never at the beginning of the conversation of what the overall problems are and therefore how we design a provision. They're just adding a little bit at the end all the time. So getting a greater partner relationship, I think, is the most important thing that larger scale bid can do. The middle ground, I think, are the ones that are in the really difficult space, because there's an expectation to deliver without really enough resource in people, time or budget to safeguard themselves. And that's where they need to be careful. Like these safe spaces, they're great projects, but there's a huge scale of activity goes on with that does require some really strong skills and resilience and budget. And they've got to continue to ensure they shore themselves up as an organisation, but keep the partners with them. A bid mustn't own that safe space on their own and get nicest way bogged down with it, lumbered with it. It's great that this PCC money has come in, but they're all short term. They're all 2 years. They're coming, time's ticking. They're coming to an end. If they're not careful, bids are going to be left holding that cost because everybody loves it. And that will massively seep into everything else they do. So shoring up the organisation, shoring up the skills within, ensuring that the partners are true partners, and having some partner agreements in place. And I think we need to get to that space, particularly councils. This is more obvious in the big cities than it is in the small at the moment, but councils need to recognise the scale of investment bids are making, and that it is a significant contribution to them now, not de minimis, and therefore the relationship should be significant, not de minimis.
I think you made a point to me previously about setting your boundaries, and that's in terms of the people you're operating with and your organisations, but also what you said earlier about the services you're setting out in your initial document, setting those out early and defending them.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, to give an example, actually, of a smaller scale location. So Salisbury it's a 2-tier authority there. So a unitary authority with Wiltshire and a city council with Salisbury, which has got a load of sort of transferred services into the city council. And as we were going into renewal last time, a third of the bid's budget was contributing to a host of city services delivered by the city council. And we were saying, well, how do we design the baseline agreement for that eventuality? Because we're actually in quite a difficult space there. And what we did was actually created a process that said, rather than it being an agreement that has schedules of services, we lean more on the sentiment of baseline, which is, what do you do and what do we do? And how do we match budgets together to deliver? And we have to both respect that there are limited budgets, there are limited capabilities. So for Salisbury's example, we created the concept of an annual baselining process that's done pre-budget setting for both parties. There's no commitment to ongoing funding beyond the current financial year. So that goes both ways. The third of budget from the bid is not committed longer term, and vice versa. And it's put a sharper focus on the scale of project that the bid will invest in, and vice versa. And some of the things may fall, but the bid won't end up. And the main reason for doing it really was the bid won't end up holding an undue cost when a local authority cuts its budget and dumps it across to the bid, which is what's been happening. Because the bids can't do that. They've got no capacity to do that. They've got small contingencies. And we talked about Christmas because it's this time of year. Christmas lights is a good example of it, where it's transferred into bids in many, many locations. The bid often is the provider, the contract holder, but there might be a contribution from a local authority. And that's at risk from a bid point of view. If they've got a 60k lighting scheme in a relatively small town, 40k of that's coming, or 20k even, is coming from the local authority. Without that annually being agreed in a budget setting exercise, they can have that 40k pulled away straight away. But the bid is holding a 60k contract. So it has to find the rest of the money, and they can't afford to find it. So safeguarding and being more rigid and being more brutal about its budget management is essential to protect the bid, because otherwise the bid falls, the bid has a financial shortfall, and there's no way of plugging that gap.
So fight for a seat at the table, shore up your organisation and your skills, set your boundaries, brutal budget management. And then a final thing about how do you set expectations and communicate all this to your businesses?
Yeah, this is a really tricky one. In terms of, it slightly depends on the location, but in terms of the presentation of issues and facts and capacity to deliver, some businesses absolutely are on side with bids. They are fully engaged. They fully understand the notion that whatever the cost of their business rate is, it doesn't really deliver the things we need. And if they want to see more in their local place, they will add a bit more. But so many are not in that headspace and expect more and can't quite balance up this obligation that bids are now having to fill the gap. And we're in danger if we don't have that strong narrative in place and an understanding of the dynamic of what would happen if we weren't there, and the fact that we can't perhaps go into some of those innovative projects now. It's a necessary evil that we carry on funding. But that narrative is necessary, and I say this to bids all the time. I think we're all getting better at it. You don't just talk to your businesses every 5 years when you go to ballot. You've got to talk to them all the time. They've got to understand us. They've got to understand, and the engagement's got to be strong. And the stronger it is, and the more responsive we are, the more wedded they are to the bid. But I would say the narrative is hard, and the ballot, just having done 5 renewals in the last about 9 weeks, all excellent results, thank goodness. Credit to all the bids that I was supporting. but the turnout is getting harder and harder. So we've got great results. We've got really strong results, but despite them being brilliant bids and really engaged, it's really, really hard to get that kind of magic beyond 50% turnout. And that mandate piece then becomes a challenge, because anyone that's anti wants to argue that, you see, businesses didn't want the bid because there was only a low turnout. So it is a really, really mixed message here. But the answer, the core answer to it, is you have to have a meaningful, real, regular relationship with those that pay you for them to understand the complexity of what we're dealing with day to day.
Excellent. We need to bring it to a close. Any final thoughts?
Oh, I've told you so much. And I guess my sort of biggest frustration is where I started with all this. We're 20 years in. There's 340 bids around the country. They're doing brilliant things. But we're definitely, things are moving so rapidly that we mustn't ignore the change that we're in. And in answer to your first question, are we about additionality? We're really, really not. Can we stop doing those things? No, we can't. But we must not mask what we're doing. We must stay really, really live to the fact that the noise we make and the impact we make must constantly be shown, and we must continue to lobby on the reality of the needs of the place. Otherwise, the problem just gets deeper and deeper for us.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Julie. And thank you, everyone, for listening to our second podcast. We may well do more. We invite ideas for topics that you would find interesting. And please do subscribe if you can. I don't know how you do it on here, but we will point you to the right place. Subscribe, and thank you again. Cheers.
Thank you.